Today we're jumping into AI in tax. And Andrew, in the last session, I was really pumping up your tires saying, if there's anyone I'm going to listen to on this topic, it's 100% you. I actually don't know anyone else that I would go to for this information. Now, this session, AI in tax, the power of two, integrating declarative and generative intelligence. I stumbled so much trying to say those two words together in that last session, Andrew. But how are you? It's so good to have you here.
Really great, Trent. Great to be here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to sharing some of the information on some AI stuff that I think people might not have been introduced to before. So keen to get on with the show.
Yeah, awesome. I'm going to let you jump straight in. There's a few hundred people here ready to check it all out. Um, I'll let you take it away and I'll let you start by just sharing a bit about yourself, but over to you.
Good man. Thanks, Trent. Okay, folks. So I think you're probably all very familiar with, and actually let me get started sharing my screen. So let me share the screen and then we can get going. So a lot of you will be familiar with
Just,
generative intelligence.
I was
Yeah,
just going to ask if you want to
is
hit
that
the
sharing?
present. Yeah, I can see the screen, but if you just want to hit
Look,
the...
I'm gonna be jumping around anyway, Trent.
Oh, okay, cool. Easy.
Yeah, so the
Yeah,
slides are just part of it. But
yeah, yeah, that's fine. No problem.
folks, I think you're all familiar with generative intelligence and the sort of stuff that you get out of ChatGPT, but probably you haven't come across declarative intelligence or what we would call good old-fashioned symbolic AI, which is driven by rules, scenarios, and queries. So I'll frame it straight away so you know roughly what we're talking about when we talk about declarative intelligence. And it goes something like this. If you reside in Australia and you are employed in Australia and your family and social ties are in Australia, then you are a tax resident. So that's the rule. And you can have a scenario which would go something like Joe resides in Australia, Joe is employed in Australia, and then you've got a query which goes something like, is Joe a tax resident? So of course, yes. And it's as simple as that. Now, what I'm going to be doing through this presentation is first I'll take you through some of my background to position how I came across the concept of symbolic AI. And then I'm going to make sure that we're all comfortable with the ideas around both the declarative and the generative intelligence before I dive into our Logit labs. So we do quite a lot of experimentation and research at Logit before we go to production with stuff. And the both the declarative and generative intelligence is stuff that we've been doing a lot of research on. So I'm excited to be sharing with you today what we've been working on. Now, just to sort of highlight again the declarative side of stuff, we're talking about rules engines, logic processors, and reasoners, particularly something called logical English, which is something that I've been working on for quite some time. Uh, Essentially machines that resolve problems deterministically and provide provable results. So just by way of background, how did I find out about this stuff and where have I come from? 1989 is the first time I got involved in accounting, and I was working part-time in an accounting firm. My job back then was to take cash books, so everything came in paper back then. And from the cash book, we would strip out journals, and those journals would get posted into Handy Ledger, which back then was available. From there, the tax returns were finally generated in and sent to the ATO on floppy disks. This is even before the days of ELS. So I've seen the whole gamut all the way through to the web world where we are now. And through the 90s, I finished my degree, worked for various accounting firms. The 2000s, I was building my own practice. During the mid-2000s, I set up an outsource company called Axsource that some of you might be familiar with. It's quite a big outsourcing company now. I think they're employing somewhere around 300 people serving the Australian market. Then along came standard business reporting around 2010, and by that stage I was quite fascinated with technology. So I sort of took a step into the world of standard business reporting and started building Lodgit. At the same time, I liquidated most of my client base and sold my stake in Axos to fund Lodgit. We actually went, well, I went on the early roadshows. I think that's probably where I met Trent. First time is the early Zero roadshows when we took what was at that stage a very sort of primitive Lodgit on the road shows around Australia. I think, I think we came close to having Lodgit being zero tax. As it turned out, that wasn't to be the case. But we kept progressing and building the product through the years from 2010 onwards to where we are today. And somewhere mid 20, it's probably around 2015, I guess. I I had a question, and the question was, well, how do we get computers to reason over tax legislation? How do we get a computer to help us determine what the result is of something like I just gave you in terms of residence? And I came into contact with a guy from Macquarie University, Professor Rolf Switzer. We embarked on an R&D project together, and it was exactly that, using symbolic AI to try to put together tax legislation in a way where we could query it. Back then, the way that we did it was very much with the kinds of symbols that you would expect to see in a logic program, and obtuse, difficult to understand. From there, I was introduced to people that were working on similar problems out of the UK. And so it turned out that I've been working with those people ever since. And we've been working on something called logical English. And essentially, logical English is a way of structuring tax legislation in a way that makes it understandable not just to humans, but also to machines. And I'm going to show you some of that today. So let's sort of keep going. And I want to sort of point out that, I'm going to be using the analogy of the auditor and the oracle. You're all obviously very familiar with the oracle. The oracle is essentially ChatGPT or Gemini or any of those systems, right? You throw in your query, you get out a response. You always get a response. Now, might be right, might be wrong. And the challenge I think we're facing in our space is, well, how do we take advantage of this technology? How do we make the most of these new types of techniques with AI to help us make sense of our complex financial regulatory space, both in terms of accounting and tax? So we've got the auditor, we've got the oracle. The auditor is rules-based and the oracle is patterns-based. We're all familiar with the oracle, and I think we inherently at this stage understand that we're dealing with something that is using neural networks. We can't quite see how it's reasoning and what it's doing, but we know that it gives us a response. It always gives us a great response. And for myself, the one thing that I love about the oracle is that it's great at putting together reports. So for instance, putting together my R&D applications, my advanced findings, it's just an amazing kind of tool that just spits out the reports as long as you give it a great prompt. It's also great for doing things like, for instance, data, anything to do with unstructured data. It's great at sort of bringing patterns together and giving us something useful. And we've all tried it, I think, for different problems. There's a number of things that we can use it for in the accounting space, all the way from classifications to report building, and obviously in and on using agents and the like. So we'll cover off some of that, because I'm not just going to be touching on the tax aspect. I've actually got some accounting stuff as well to sort of highlight how we can adopt both the oracle and the auditor for helping us through resolving our problems. So the auditor, let's have another look at the auditor again. And so what is the actual function of the system that works on the computer to act as an auditor? Essentially what it's doing is it's doing a search and unification across the problem. So we always need a rule, and this is obviously not a real tax rule, but it's something I've just put together as a simple example. If we have a rule that goes something like a client is a high earner, if the client has an income of an amount and the amount is greater than 100,000, then we can use a computer to help us determine when we have a fact like a client has an income of 150,000 and a query, is the client a high income earner? We can use a computer to reason over that in a symbolic fashion, which is quite different to the way that the Oracle works. This is not a black box. We get a very deterministic outcome when we use this kind of technical approach, because essentially what the auditor is doing is it's pattern matching around the conditions. So we can see over here in the search and unification, there's a certain goal that it'll try to achieve first. So first trying to find the income of the client and see how it sort of fits into whether it's above the 100,000 or not. So it finds the amount, the earnings of the client, 150,000, and then its sub goal is triggered to work out, well, is the 150,000 greater than 100,000? And if it evaluates to true, the whole unification is met and we reach a conclusion to yes. So it seems quite elementary, and at a certain level it is, but when it actually comes to practice, you'll see in a while that, obviously with the tax legislation that we're dealing with in Australia, the tax legislation can get really complex and there can be a lot of goals and sub-goals all the way down. So let's just highlight again why we need auditors. And I think it's worth pointing out that one of the first things that we learn when we come into the accounting space is that we want information that's reliable, objective, consistent, and verifiable. And the same with, so tax and accounting, want compliant, accurate, and traceable information. And this has been highlighted lately by Zach Corman with a post that he put on X where, it's got a lot of traction. A lot of people have noticed this, and that is that, a simple Excel problem using Copilot, 1 + 2 + 3, and the Copilot provided an answer of 50. So he's come out and said, well, really for high stakes processes in finance, logistics, or compliance, you need verifiable logic. You don't need a conversational partner. You need a system where every step is deterministic and every outcome can be audited. And I think we all inherently know that when it comes to presenting our results to the tax office or building out sets of financial statements, we need to know how we reached our conclusion. So as great as something like ChatGPT is, we need to know that not every it's the hammer and the nail analogy, right? Not every problem is a nail, and you can't use your GPT for absolutely everything. There's a time and the place for using the given tools that we're using in our space. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump into the Logic Labs. Now, certainly our Logic Labs is not as extravagant and fancy as this picture, which obviously I use GPT to generate. But let's go through and have a look. So before I get stuck into that, I'm just going to sort of highlight what we're doing inside of Logic. Let's just see. So I'm just going to take you into a client in Logic where I want to highlight that essentially Logic does 3 things with one data set. You import your data, and out of that data set, we give you the ability to generate work papers. So this is a very simple kind of example here where you're putting together your work papers. You're generating your financial statements, which you can publish and send off to your clients for signing. It's got compilation report, directors, declaration, etc. And the form, all filled and completed from a single data set using as much automation as is possible, right? So that's what we're doing today. And the problem for us is to go, well, how can we improve what we're doing to give you better guardrails and to give you more automation? So stepping through from here, one of the things that we've been doing is we have experimented quite extensively with the typical Oracle or the generative AI. And you can see here, this is Tax Genie, which we make available for our Logic users. We've had this running since back in early 2024. Actually, we launched it probably late 2023. And what we've been doing ever since is just seeing how people use it, experimenting with how we adopt this system. And you can see if we go through here where people have been asking different queries, and I can certainly throw in a quick query here to see how this thing behaves. And I think you're all going to be very comfortable with this kind of approach, right? So it's just the old ask a question and get a response from the engine. And in the back end of this, we're just using the old GPT 4.0, I think. So it's not even the latest engine in the back end. But certainly when it comes to completing a problem like this using a generative approach, don't forget you can't paste the entire tax legislation into a context window on something like GPT. It's just not going to handle the full legislation. It's way too big. So essentially what we're doing in the background is we're using search engines, and we use vector database search engines, particularly around the data sources, which in this case, we're just searching across the ATO general website and also across the legislation and supporting material, which even here you can narrow, if you wanted to, you can narrow it down and you can go right into the principal legislation, right into the taxation, and then right into the Income Tax Act 1997, into the guts of it to sort of delimit where you want to carry out your search so that the system will only grab the information that you want in order to generate a response. And of course, here you can see generative AI gives us a good response and it's accurate. $100 million exceeds the turnover. It gives you the two conditions that must be satisfied. And then it also then points you to where it got its result. Now, this is obviously the issue, right? Because you cannot know exactly how it determined its result other than it grabbed information out of these various references. And if you were to then go, okay, what is this about? You could jump off and dive into the, into the actual Income Tax Assessment Act, or you could ask for a summary of something like maybe you want the summary on the tax rates and codes, and then the system will give you a summary of that piece of the information that it used to provide the guidance for what it ultimately gave you here. But here is a great example where, this actually doesn't look like it's directly related to the query that I put in, this response. And that's part of the problem with any kind of generative approach, is that when you're using search engines that are going and making decisions as to what to grab, you don't always know quite what inputs are coming in. That gives the system the possibility of either getting the response out of context, puts the wrong information in, or maybe it does something like an hallucination and you get results that are not absolutely spot on. So generative AI certainly has its space or has its place, but it has its limitations as well. That sort of led us into the fact that, how do we do searching? Maybe what we need to do is we need to limit our searching so that we can search using sort of traditional approaches. Like, for instance, maybe we would have a keyword search and then have that keyword search across the top of that knowledge base, which is a combination of the ATO website, which obviously we have a copy of. And then we could have a look. So for instance, that query that I just put in there, which is section 1525, I'm asking for information on that. Maybe I can then come in and see where it's grabbing that out of. And of course, for me, I'm discriminating out of all of these results. And I'm going, I'm going to have a look in the legislation and supporting material, because that's where I know that I want to find the actual section 1552, right? But of course, you can see that the system does a search and will find references to other 152 section, well, extensions of that section elsewhere in tax determinations, etc. So
And
really,
Andrew, I had a quick
hey,
question
go
for you
ahead.
if I could.
Sure.
It's relevant to what you're talking about.
Okay.
So Lisa in the chat's just saying what would be the benefit of trying to do these directly in here as opposed to maybe doing it directly in ChatGPT. And I think I know the answer, but I thought I would ask you to maybe explain the benefit of having it all under one roof.
Well, the reason that we've taken this approach is to delimit where the information is coming from, because don't forget, ChatGPT has been trained on a massive corpus of information, which would include, you know, information that was on the web from maybe stuff that had been written by one of the big four accounting firms, maybe written by CPA and others. Whereas what we're trying to do is just provide a very concise, direct set of information directly into the tax legislation to a specific area. But yes, you're dead right. I mean, you know, in ChatGPT, you would well and truly be able to ask that question and get a similar kind of response. It probably will find the right, and the latest GPT, which is going out and doing searches, is going to do a very similar job, right? It's probably going to find the same section for you. Here, it's just a case of giving you a set of tools that is delimiting so that you can then go into those specific areas of the tax knowledge base, essentially. So that's why we went through the process of putting this together, was to see if we could, if from a research standpoint, we could refine how you will then go and do your searches. One of the things we also put in here was a reverse search, because what we wanted to experiment with was, right, you know, when you are doing a search, maybe you want to be very precise around, okay, so we'll try this, we'll add a keyword and we will add business. So we will then do a search. Now this search is going to use different search engines to go and search for different pieces of information on the web, and then we can condense all of that information and ask a query around it. This is going to take a bit of time to find. So while this is doing its thing, I want to jump off to a problem that is in the same vein, but not directly able to be reasoned over from the same point of view of the auditor, which will find you an exact result, because this is one of the areas in tax where you don't have a clean-cut answer. And that is someone a trader or is someone an investor? And this case is that I'm using here is the case of Mr. Wong. This is a decision input. You'll find it as a decision impact statement, Wong and the Commissioner of Taxation, 2011-3450. And this is actually my accounting firm that worked on behalf of Mr. Wong to prove that in his case, he carried out a single trade for his wife, who is a doctor. This is a long time ago. Carried out a single trade for his wife, and he essentially did the equivalent of putting all the money on black at the casino. He put a lot of money on a single trade, close to $1 million. And as you can guess, that trade turned out to go the wrong way, and all of the money was lost. And essentially what we ended up doing was claiming that because we said said that she was a trader, we offset that trading loss with her income from her business as a doctor. See, it's a doctor business. And because of that, because there was such a large loss, we offset it over 3 years. Of course, the ATO objected. We challenged and won on the basis that we could prove that he was actually a trader and that this was actually a trade. But when you look at the case of trading versus investing, we've got this idea of using what's called a Bayesian belief network that you can hang together. And I've actually given you the link to the software over here, so you can actually put this together. That's the actual file that is built here. And what this does is this takes advantage of stipulating data properties on certain facts around trading and investing. The data properties are the average hold times. So generally we know that if you're holding your shares for a long time, probably not a trader. If you're holding them for a short time, you probably are a trader. And the number of trades. If you're in and out all the time, that adds to the probability. But again, there's no single one aspect that makes you a trader or an investor. You've got to look at the whole case, the whole situation, the whole scenario. And here are our object properties. We've got, did he keep capital gains reports or did he keep profit and loss report? Because if you're tracking something in profit and loss, probably you're trading. Are you very active with your trading? The more active you are, the more likely you are that you're a trader. Do you have evidence that you've done any short selling? Again, that adds to the weighting that you are a trader. And do you use technical analysis tools? Again, that adds something again to whether you're a trader. Now, when you bring that, using this model, the Bayesian belief network, when you bring the data sets together, the system can then make a determination as to whether you're a trader or an investor. Now, there's two ways to get your data points. Either you're getting your data points from you're just making an informed decision, right? Let's put some weights against these manually, or you're going in and looking at the case law and going, well, there's a lot of case law that indicates that the ATO or the courts will determine that you're a trader if you've always got this kind of set of situations going on with the way that you're carrying out your activity. So this was just a really great example, I think, of something in the tax world, which is not black and white. We're not dealing with the deterministic problem that something like an auditor or a symbolic AI can solve. So I thought I'd throw that in there while our tax genie was going through and searching, and you can see we just use different search engines to go and find information on capital gains and business. And then from here, we're saying, well, what you can do from here is you might go, well, let's select a certain number of these. And then with that, we will use those as the inputs. And of course, you could summarize each of those. And you might say, well, let's just ask a question around using the information that has been found to get some kind of answer, but specifically based on what we just asked, right? So business assets, the subject to CGT include those, qualify as CGT, and so we can read through this and we can see that obviously we're getting some kind of result out based on very specific sections that we wanted to query over the top of. So that really is the Tax Genie engine. We did experiment with using agents to put together some calculators. We just copied a whole lot of calculators, but using an agentic framework for each of the calculators. If you want, you can come and play around with these on the Tax Genie, but essentially they're very much emulating what you can actually find on the ATO website, more of a kind of a research project. And also in here, what we did do, and this is something else that I would say is where by delimiting very specifically a particular search, we might go, okay, so how do we report capital gains in a company tax return? And this is the sort of thing that at the moment, of course, you can just jump in and use Tax Genie on the side, but later on we will implement this into the actual tax forms. So I guess unlike something like GPT, you say, how do I report capital gains? It knows to only give you the answers out of the company tax return instructions. So here you can see that if you look at the bottom left, you can see there's this specific URL where it's pointing to where you can go and read the exact tax instructions. But of course, this is your little summary here, right? So that's the kind of experimentation that we've been doing from there, and maybe you just want to do a summary across the top of the instructions, see what those instructions are about. Again, it's about specifically limiting your search to only the instruction set for the company tax return, rather than getting a very broad set of information that might have information that's not really related to the company tax return, but it's gone out and it's sort of mixed in something from the tax return. for a trust, for instance, and it's mixed that into the mix, and you're getting answers which might not be exact, right? So now let's just go back, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through to our logical English research. So simplistic interface, but what I want to show you here is essentially what we're dealing with in terms of symbolic AI. This is essentially where we've got to with our research. We've built knowledge bases for different areas. The areas that I'm going to start with is probably, I think I'll start with the GST turnover, and I'm going to show you how we put the rules together, right? So we talked about needing a set of rules, which is essentially the legislation written in a format that is suitable for both humans, so we can all read these rules, and we can also feed these rules into a reasoning engine, which will then do the equivalent of a search and unification across the top to find a result. So we've got the concept of templates. The templates allow you to stipulate something about something, like an entity and then a turnover as a value, and then it goes on to say the turnover an entity for the current month is an amount, the turnover an entity for the previous 11 months is an amount, the turnover on the entity for the next 11 months is an amount. Because when you're trying to determine if someone or an entity should be registered for GST or not, you can either look back or you can look forward and make a prediction whether they should register or not. So this is a very concise, precise way of documenting the legislation in a way that our machine can then reason over the top and do the matching for us. Not in the way that a GPT engine does it. That does it quite differently. This is matching exactly so that when you get a response, it's a deterministic response, and I'm going to show you now, but let's just keep going through the knowledge base. The knowledge base includes, and you'll notice how it's written. It's written, an entity must register for GST if the entity is a not-for-profit and the entity has a turnover and the turnover is above or equal to 150,000, or the entity's projected turnover is a projection and the projection is greater than or equal to 150,000, right? And then it goes on to say, because of course, to differentiate between a not-for-profit and a profit, we're just simply saying, well, an entity must register for GST if it is not the case the entity is a not-for-profit. So sort of limiting out, well, in this case, we don't talk about not-for-profits. We're talking about other types of entities. And then we all know that that limit is 75,000, right? So again, the knowledge base goes on in quite some detail. We've got our total business income, we've got our GST turnover, and then we've got some scenarios here that we can use to test the engine with. And of course, you can write any kind of scenarios and then test or put the scenario against the engine and get a result. So let's try this one. We will go for GST. We will go for GST turnover, and we will try significant exports business. Now you can see the scenario for this is it's got GST, it's got sales to associates, 2,000 worth of sales not connected with an enterprise you run, 50,000 in sales not connected with Australia, and then 75,000 sales of goods and services, right? And then we get our explanation. And this is what I'm talking about in terms of that exact decision tree to show you how the machine actually reached its conclusion that is the GST turnover, because, and then it'll take you through what's included, what's not included, and what gets summed up there. So that's really a good example of how that symbolic AI is working to reach a conclusion. We might try a different one. So let's try for A and A. So Cheerio Charity, so this is asking whether this entity should register for GST or not, quite a simple example. So Cheerio Charity must register for GST because Cheerio Charity is not for profit. And this one down here is a little bit more extensive. Does not operate for profit, has income of 160. 160 is greater than 150, and therefore this entity must register for GST. So again, the system reasoning over the top of the knowledge base in a very different way to what you would get with GPT. Again, don't forget GPT will probably give you a good answer, but you won't necessarily be able to backtrack exactly through the neural network to find out exactly how that machine derived its conclusion, whereas with the symbolic AI approach, you can. So let's have a look at another example. We'll try another example in here. We'll go Tom's Bakery, again, a simple example. So Tom's Bakery's got 80,000 and we get an explanation. And again, pretty simple, because Tom's Bakery is not for profit. Tom's Bakery has 80 grand, 80 grand is greater than 75. So it's giving you the way that it reached its conclusion. We'll try a few more examples and we go through. I think we'll have a look at pay-as-you-go. So I've got some pay-as-you-go examples here. You can see you can either ask for just an answer or the explanation. The explanation is always more interesting. So this is to determine whether or what your variation should be on a PAYG variation. Working through this sort of really gave me the idea that, some of the stuff gets really complex, and whomever's doing PAYG variations, there's a lot of complexity that goes into just knowing how to carry out a variation, which I guess makes this, producing a variation an area where it's easy to make a mistake. So again, the templates are all described. I'm not going to waste too much of your time going through this in great detail, but essentially the whole knowledge base around how you carry out variations has to be encoded into the knowledge base, and not just the knowledge of, for instance, the estimated franking credit is an amount, but you've also got to say things like, right, what is a quarter? Because this kind of machine has no context over what a quarter is. You actually have to specify what the quarter is, and then you have to say, obviously, quarter one is previous to quarter two. That's how you build the knowledge base here. And then further to that, the estimated tax for the year, you're putting in a formula for how it will do the calculations. So estimated annual net tax for the year. This is simply telling the machine that we want tax that's greater than zero, right? Otherwise this kind of system can just fail with a null value. But the estimated annual net tax for the entity for the year is an amount, and ultimately we work through the equation and we work out the estimated net tax payable for the amount for the year is calculated as follows: the estimated taxable income, the applicable tax rate, and then you've got to take into account the tax offsets and the tax credits, which is minus the tax offsets minus the tax credits. I think a lot of you will be familiar with this. Now, going further through this, we've got the rules around whether it's a base rate entity or not, whether to use 25% or 30%, the varied amount for the quarter, breaking down the quarters, the new varied rate, the installment income, and then the general rule which tells the system what income to treat as business or investment income and what income to treat as excluded income. So when we finally got all of this, we've got some scenarios here that we can test. So the scenarios work with the queries, and let's have a quick look. We'll test estimated tax. Sometimes I have to refresh this engine to get it to give us the right response, but let's just try estimated tax and test quarter two, and we'll run that. So this is the scenario. It talks about the types of income that this entity has. It's got royalties, it's got capital gains, it's got other bits and pieces, and then we get our explanation. So the estimated tax for the Australian entity is 25,000, and it'll take you through exactly how it reached that conclusion of 25,000 as the tax with what income it's, well, this is probably quite trivial, right? Because it's just the 25% times the 100,000, but it's used the correct income in this scenario. Let's try another one. So we've got a PAYG income, and we'll go test quarter two. And and the estimated, now this is telling us the PAYG income is 75,000 because, and it's telling us what income to include and what income to ignore, because certain income is not to be included and other income is to be included, and then it'll add it all up for you at the same time. So let's try one more. Payable ATO quarter 3. So this is actually, we want this time to know how much to pay. ATO 3 quarter 4. Right, so we want to know, given that some tax credits are available, an installment has been paid, and then, right, what do we want to know in terms of, okay, so that one I think I need to refresh it on that one. Take it back to the PAYG, and I'll just plug in that query again. So we got payable, and the scenario is ATO 3 quarter 4, and we'll get our explanation. Okay. So for whatever reason, my system is not wanting to play ball right now, which is typical for a demo. But what I will do out of this is I will just show you something else, which is where this gets quite interesting, is that if you do have something like GPT, I'm using Gemini here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you so we're going to have a new chat, and I'm going to use the knowledge that's encoded here. We're going to use that knowledge, and we're going to use it in the engine, which is the Gemini, which is a probabilistic method, but it's going to use the same knowledge. So let me get the whole knowledge base, and I'm going to paste it in there. I don't need the scenarios.
Hey Andrew, I'm just coming in with a quick time check as well, mate.
Okay, how long we got?
We probably have a few minutes before we need to start to wrap and finish the session.
Okay. Let's quickly go in here. Now, so from here, we've got a query that we can go something like, we can actually plug our query in. So let me get the query, and I'm going to ask this to calculate the new rate, given the knowledge that it has, right? So we'll see how this system does using the knowledge that we gave it. And that would give you something that's called a neurosymbolic approach, where you're combining the two techniques. You're combining the rules and the generative AI to make our conclusion. And yes, it reaches a 15% rate. That's your new varied rate, which is actually correct, right? But again, you would then need to have to trace back through this what it's given you to make sure that it is actually correct. Whereas if you're using the deterministic approach or the rules-based approach, then as long as your inputs are correct, then you know that you can trust what comes out the other side. That's the difference. The one other thing I wanted to say before I go finish off on this is that we have been doing quite a lot of research also with accounting. We've been putting together a journalizing, analytical reasoning, and verifiable inference system. It's a different way of doing accounting, but we're essentially using rules to bring together reports. So we've got a trial balance, and you can see we're actually showing you the rules here. So if I had a look at the balance sheet, so we give the system, instead of the typical programmatic approach of telling the system what to do in terms of add these up, do this, then that, which is a typical kind of way that you build a system like QuickBooks Xero or Mile, we're trying a different approach, which is to use rules where you don't tell the system how to do it. You just ask it for a response given the rules. And the rules you'd put in would be something like, how to balance off a balance sheet, the component aggregation, and then, if we're using assets are positive values and liabilities are negative values, we're actually then able to get a validation off the bottom of any kind of accounting set. So we're using rules across the top of this. And then we're also playing around with in terms of validating and adjusting. So if I've got a file, let me just put in a file here. That's, let's just go to the checkpoint. We're using the accounting knowledge, and then we're asking an agent to carry out a verification. And if there is a variance, we've got some instructions for the agent to put together a journal. So you can see we put a journal together to fix the variance between the bank and the system ledger, and it's putting the amount into suspense. So we've just told the agent, very simple example of how we can introduce agents into the mix. The same thing with a hire purchase. We might
Oh, we'll need
have,
we'll need to wrap after this one, please, mate.
okay, yeah, no worries. Okay, so I'll just put that in, upload that, and again, the system will look for the missing HPs, create our journal entries for us. But essentially, just to wrap up, our goal is obviously to use the knowledge of both the declarative approach and the, I guess, your typical GPT kind of approach to, at the end of the day, add further automation to logic systems, and also to add better guardrails in there so that when you do get results, you can have higher degrees of confidence around what you're getting. So folks, that's pretty much it.
Awesome. Andrew, thank you so much, mate. Really appreciate your time. Um, there was a lot in that session. So if you
Yeah,
like this session,
jumped through
everyone,
it pretty
please jump
fast.
into the chat and thank Andrew for going through everything in so much detail. There's a lot of work that goes into this stuff, and I don't know if I said this already, but people don't get paid to do these sessions. Like, it's just for your benefit. So if you enjoyed this, please thank and tell Andrew that you enjoyed it and why you enjoyed it. You'll be able to find him on LinkedIn. There's plenty of links dropped through the site. Watch through the recording. Everything there is super practical, which is what we know what you all love. We do need to wrap this session because we're going to go and start a practice session for the next ones that are about to appear. We have two sessions coming in at 2 o'clock, which is in 10 minutes time. The first one is the AI ready website. So 5 fixes you can do to boost visibility and leads on your website. This is with Scott McNaught from Oncord. Scott's fantastic and very good when it comes to the website building side of things. If you haven't seen that, recommend check that out. The other one is called The Perfect Tech Stack Does Not Exist, but the Perfect Process Does. This is with Amy Holdsworth from Clarity Street. So that is coming up at 2 o'clock as well. If you've seen Scott or Amy before, we've had them on in QuickFest and other things in the past. They do them. They're great people, good content, good speakers. So I think you will enjoy all of that. I'm going to wrap and end the session right now so that we can get these next ones running. Andrew, thank you so much for your
Awesome.
time.
Thanks, Trent. Thanks, folks. Have a
Thanks,
great day.
everyone.
Bye.
Chat to you all soon. Bye bye.